random into the crowd. It became quiet. I stood with my father in the second row. The shots were fired from Theatre Square, where there was a machine gun firing through a missing wall. Most people were wounded. People crawled, wailed, shouted, and begged for help. I remember my father was sobbing. I remember tears streaming from his eyes. I remember that he said to me, "Go away from here." He didn't say run. He said, "Go away." He let go of my hand. I left. It seems the Germans didn't notice. I began to run. I heard firing. I heard screams. I walked away because I did not have a grown-up's imagination. I was simply carrying out my father's order to leave. I didn't fully understand the situation. Those who remained seemed hypnotized, in a state of shock. They stood calmly, waiting for death.
As the death toll mounted, the civilians, caught in the crossfire, began to turn on their would-be liberators.
I entered a cellar full of civilians, and I remember a mother showing me her child, whose face was burnt. And she cried out, "See what you have done."
And their curses flew at me like bullets. So you wanted an uprising, did you? That was a very difficult experience.
After 40 days of bloody fighting, the Home Army faced the prospect of defeat. With great reluctance, terms of surrender were being negotiated with the Germans. But on the brink of capitulation, the uprising was given new and dramatic hope. For the first time since July, Soviet planes appeared over Warsaw and bombed German positions in the eastern suburb of the city. On the ground, the Soviet army finally began to push on Warsaw. Part of the Red Army were in fact Polish forces, conscripted by the Russians on their march westward. They were known as the Berling Army. Ryszard Zgorski was one of their pilots.
The order came that we were to airdrop aid to the resistance fighters in Warsaw. We were sent food, arms and ammunition, and this was all packed into parachute containers. A few days before the airdrops were to begin, the NKVD decided that the parachutes were not necessary and they were taken away. Everything was repacked into ordinary grain sacks, and these were dropped. We flew relatively low, but so what? A sack dropped from 30 meters, all you get on the ground is rubbish.
I almost got hit on the head with one of these sacks in Hoosier Street near Three Crosses Square. It hit a house, went through 2 floors and landed on the ground just behind me. There was nothing to pick up.
The Red Army took the eastern suburb of Warsaw, and on September the 15th sent a detachment of their Polish troops across the river, bringing with them much-needed weapons and ammunition.
There was great joy. At last, we were seeing Poles in Polish army uniforms in Warsaw. It was very moving for us.
For the beleaguered fighters, this was a sign of hope at last. The situation improved even further when, a few days later, it seemed that help was also coming from the west. On September the 18th, more than 100 American planes flew over Warsaw.
Suddenly, in broad daylight, the sky is roaring. It was amazing. Hundreds of planes flying over.
They flew 4, 8 abreast, in line, plane after plane.
Quite simply joy. People ran out into the streets whether they were being shot at or not. We thought that real help was coming for Warsaw.
The Americans, however, had come too late. Thousands of tons of supplies were dropped, but only a fraction reached the Poles. The rest fell behind enemy lines. The Americans did not return. Jubilation turned to despair. On the riverbank, the freshly arrived Polish troops were fighting for their lives.
We are under fire. The Berlin troops are terrified. They are country boys who had been forcibly conscripted. They had been given guns which they didn't know how to fire. They had never been in a larger town, let alone a ruined fighting city like Warsaw. They hide in various holes, in the cellars, crying, praying, cursing. It is desperate.
Again and again, the Berlin troops called their Soviet commanders for reinforcements.
And the radio operators call non-stop in Russian. This is Swan. Electron. Why are you not replying? They were calling the opposite riverbank, codenamed Electron. And our side was Swan. And this Swan kept calling Electron, and Electron remained silent.
Even the Germans were amazed at the Russian inaction.
All along the banks of the Vistula, we had 2 positions, one aimed at the Russians and one aimed at the Poles. Yes, we were prepared, but the Russians didn't fire one bullet.
For the first time in the history of the uprising, there were more weapons than hands to fire them. There were terrible situations. The wounded would say to you, "Swear you won't allow the Germans to abuse me before I die. Kill me yourself."
It was now obvious that Stalin had no intention of saving the uprising. Indeed, it suited his own ends for the free Poles to be slaughtered. By the end of September, the last districts held by the Home Army fell to the Germans. The survivors withdrew to the city center through the sewers.
These were scenes from Dante's Inferno. Terrible. A vast number of corpses. The Germans threw carbide down, which mixed with water gave off a poison gas. People didn't know what to do. They choked, trampled over each other. There were grenades hanging under the exits. These could be set off by accident, wounding and killing.
They pulled out these mud-covered forms. They were completely exhausted, pale. The boys were unshaven, caked in this stinking sludge. It was terrible. And for me, it was like the end. The capitulation had to take place.
Kapitulacja już musiała nastąpić.